So, Mr. DeFazio, I yield to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would point out that, well, first, a couple of questions of FEMA, and then I will point something out. Mr. Grimm, does FEMA have the authority to regulate privately funded development on private lands under the NFIP?
I'm sorry.
Simple yes or no would do.
No.
Okay, good. Thank you. Now, you are going to be required, because of the RPA in Oregon, to amend your regulations to include an ESA standard. Will that change apply only to the state of Oregon, or will it apply to all of the states of America?
When we change our regulation, it applies to all 22,000 communities.
Okay, all 22,000 communities, which I assume are scattered among the 50 states.
Correct.
Okay. And then, you know, that, have you consulted with, I assume you have in-house counsel, or do you use the Justice Department for legal consultations on your authority?
We have in-house counsel, sir.
Okay. And what does in-house counsel say about you asserting regulatory authority that wasn't extended to you by the United States Congress?
That we can only do what is within our authorities, and there are concerns over a number of the RPAs being outside of our current authorities.
So then arguably, perhaps, your agency, in exceeding its authority to follow the directives of National Marine Fisheries and agreeing to adopt this RPA, is vulnerable to being sued.
Yes, and for the RPAs that are not within our legal authorities, we would seek other alternative RPAs, working with the states and the communities to implement the intent of the RPAs as issued by Marine Fisheries.
Now, the authority granted you by Congress is you get communities who wish to participate in the program to adopt minimum standards.
Correct.
Yes. So in this case, you are far exceeding the minimum standard approach.
That is correct, sir.
How can that be? Never mind, that's speculative. But the point is, I'm having trouble tracking this whole thing. I put up a map earlier showing downtown Coos Bay, Oregon. And under what you're being forced to adopt by NMFS in declaring, this area will be within the enhanced 100-year floodplain. Well, we don't know what the enhanced 100-year floodplain is yet, do we?
We don't, sir.
We don't. So this is actually just using the existing 100-year floodplain. One would assume that when you include climate change, that these floodplains are probably going to, especially in coastal areas, become much larger.
Yeah, from FEMA's perspective, that when you include the climate change, the erosion zones, future conditions, hydrology, we would expect floodplains to significantly increase, and then the applicable floodplain management regulations that we would, through the RPA.
So many properties now that aren't required to have federal flood insurance in order to obtain bank financing will be required to in the future.
Yes, sir. When we revise our regulations, that would apply.
Mm-hmm. Now, didn't Biggert Waters require an advisory committee for mapping? Because mapping has been controversial and, in fact, in part led to the adoption of Biggert Waters. Is that correct?
Absolutely. The Technical Mapping Advisory Council was established by BW12 to provide guidance to FEMA and advice on our mapping standards.
Right. Doesn't the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, of which NMFS is a subsidiary, so to speak, don't they have a seat on that advisory committee?
They do have a seat on that.
Okay, and has the advisory committee proposed this dramatic change to the rules?
The committee has proposed some future conditions mapping, some erosion mapping, not necessarily in line with what the RPAs are recommending. That's one of our concerns, is that Congress established TMAC and to provide guidance to FEMA. And when I personally was involved with the negotiations with Marine Fisheries on this was one of the key issues that I brought up, in that that the RPAs must be aligned with recommendations from the Mapping Advisory Council, and that is one of our.
But in this case, what's being recommended for Oregon, which is going to require a regulatory change which will apply nationwide, is not following the advice of that committee.
There are differences.
Yes, there are. So one sub-agency of an agency that's represented on the advisory committee established by Congress is forcing you to exceed your legal authority, to impose more than minimum standards, and to link the Endangered Species Act to the NFIP program eligibility requirements. Now, what kind of a change is that going to be? Some say, oh, it's just really simple. You just reference it. Do you think that can be done in one sentence? I've never seen an administrative regulation that was one sentence long.
Yeah,
I mean, usually we write one sentence and you write 100 pages. So how's that going to work?
Thank you, sir. From FEMA's perspective, you're right. There is one reference to a legal requirement or a regulatory change in the RPAs. We're currently evaluating that. We believe there are going to be a number of other regulatory changes that are required, particularly around redefinition of the special flood hazard area and minimum standards.
Okay. So to Ms. Shirley, now, you referenced the potential conflict. I mean, since it's kind of odd, Washington State, where our regional office of NIMS is based, was allowed to go with performance standards, but it's a state that does not have comprehensive statewide land use planning. Oregon, a state that has comprehensive statewide land use planning, is being told, no, you must go with a prescriptive one-size-fits-all solution being dictated by a federal agency to another federal agency that will be imposed on the state. You already talked about the logistical problems of having 232 communities change their local plans. Having been a county commissioner, I'm quite familiar with the process, and you're right, it can be done in the time frame we're talking about. But one of the key things in our land use law is compact growth, sometimes controversial, recently in city of Eugene, which I represent, because even though it's sort of optimal for planners to densify, sometimes the people who live there don't like it. But the point is that's probably the major goal, in addition to resource conservation, that is to avoid the sprawl that many other states have seen. But there's also another thing where communities are supposed to have a stock of buildable land or developable land, both for commercial, industrial, and or residential purposes. So if our core areas, particularly downtown Coos Bay, which cries out for a lot of renovation and redevelopment, is off limits, and the city wishes or has to accommodate growth, then they are going to have a very arguable case to greatly expand their urban growth boundary. Isn't that correct? I mean, it seems to me the only option.
Yes, we share that concern. We also believe that the RPA, as it exists today and can hopefully be negotiated further in the future, allows for redevelopment projects that incorporate some improvement to the salmon habitat without stopping development altogether. So I think there's a middle ground there, and through the work groups and working with FEMA, we hope to find that middle ground.
But it's not, I mean, it's not explicit in the RPA that those sorts of, I mean, since they moved us to a dictated approach versus a performance-based approach, it's not clear we'll be able to do that.
It could be difficult. The RPA is not it's not cast in stone. It does have a little bit of flexibility, and we need to find and leverage those flexibilities.
Mm-hmm. I'm just, as a, I don't even, there's no one here, I guess, who can really ask the question. I mean, how does Highway 101 become critical salmon habitat? Mr. Chandler, can you help me with that one? Do you have any thoughts? I mean, it's a highway, and, and it's between the harbor and downtown, and then you have downtown where the local newspaper, hopefully they have a reporter listening, because they are critical salmon. They should just look around the office and be really careful, because they might step on a salmon.
Ranking Member and DeFazio, members, I think the answer to that probably involves working for a federal agency that isn't here. There's no way it is salmon habitat. And that's part of the problem, I believe, of having what should be a science-based approach being handled as though it was a matter of philosophy. Yes, we in Oregon, as Congressman DeFazio has indicated, we have a long history of salmon protection, of working on natural resource protection, of having urban planning that has as its objective saving resource land. To come in and say now that a main highway or NATO Parkway in Portland or pick your street in any city of those 232 cities in Oregon is now a salmon habitat is ridiculous. And that's been part of our reaction to this, is that it simply doesn't make sense on the ground as we have built in Oregon. As most of you in your states, I know, the people who settled there settled near the waterways because that would be silly to settle where there wasn't water. So most cities in this country are built around lakes, streams, rivers. Oregon's no different. Most of our development is now, by state law and state and local planning, focused on those downtown core areas, as Congressman DeFazio indicated, to avoid urban sprawl. And what this does to that notion of taking those waterways off limits, and now we, for 20 years worth of land supply, or simply to keep up with the growing population, we expand out onto the farmland, which is exactly what the last 50 years of policy in Oregon has said we should not do. And frankly, my industry supports that, and we're aghast at this as well, that what we thought we were doing is now being changed by fiat, including apparently the designation of Highway 101 as a salmon habitat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.